All right, folks, welcome into another episode of our sesquicentennial webinar series on the 1870s Mennonite migrants to Manitoba. My name is Ben Nobbs-Thiessen. I'm the Chair of Mennonite Studies here at the University of Winnipeg and the co-director, along with my colleague, Dr. Aileen Friesen, of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies. Nice to see a lot of friendly, familiar faces in the virtual room. People are letting us know they're coming in from Coquitlam, BC, Elmer, Ontario, just to name a few locations. Plenty of folks here in Winnipeg, just down the street. I see a Warman, Saskatchewan. So great to have everyone joining from across the country, and certainly in the case of Natalia Wenger, perhaps outside, I think beyond, coming from Ukraine. So we're looking forward to getting started here with Dr. Shelisa Klassen. I'll give a brief intro to Shelisa. I will say a few words of promotion. You may have seen the poster slide for our fall conference, which these webinar series are kind of building towards. We're very excited about that. And then we'll take some time. Shelisa can take as long as she likes, really, within the hour-long boundaries of our webinar to talk to us about the theme of her talk tonight, Mennonites meeting their new neighbors in this early moment of arrival in Manitoba. And then we'll certainly allow time for the Q&A, which we always do. So you'll see, as I've mentioned in the past, the Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you hover the cursor over there, please feel free to write in questions in the Q&A. If you put them in the chat, I'll probably see them there too, but the Q&A is easiest for me to keep track of it all. And so we'll pummel Shelisa with questions as she finishes up, and you can just write them as she's talking, whatever comes to mind. So without further ado, I'd first like to begin with the formal land acknowledgement that we're gathered here on Treaty 1 territory, the homeland of the Anishinaabe and Shinnu, Assiniboine, Cree, Dakota, Dene peoples, and of course the heartland of the Red River Métis. This is something we will be considering and will probably emerge in the talk as well, as we're thinking about Mennonites arriving as settlers as part of a settler colonial project and encountering their new Indigenous and of course non-Indigenous neighbors in the context of newly created province of Manitoba. I also want to then turn to a brief introduction to Shelisa, who is familiar to me as she had an office just across the hall from where I'm sitting here on the campus at University of Winnipeg, while she was a Plett Foundation postdoctoral fellow in previous years. Shelisa grew up in Warden, Manitoba. She's the descendants of those Mennonites who all immigrated to Manitoba in the 1870s. And she spent her academic career, which was, she finished her PhD recently at the University of Manitoba, studying the history of Manitoba largely through newspapers and other print media. Her work has been published in our Journal of Mennonite Studies, as well as Prairie History Journal. I've heard rumors that there is a future book publication we'll hope will emerge from this project as well, but I won't say any more there. She's taught courses in Canadian and Indigenous history at Canadian Mennonite University, also here at the University of Winnipeg. And she's just about to start teaching in 2 weeks or so at the University of Alberta. So currently, she's out there in Alberta as a postdoctoral fellow with the Chester Ronnian Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life at the University of Alberta, where she's working on projects related to settler colonialism and religion. So thanks, Shelisa, for joining us here. I'm just about to turn it over to you. And I'll also mention that we bring these webinar series to you in partnership with the Mennonite Heritage Village, which has their own exhibit, which has just recently opened this summer on the 1870s migration as well. And so I would encourage everyone, if you have time, to get yourself down to Steinbach to see that exhibit too. I think that's all. I always forget something, but Shelisa, please feel free to take it away, and then I'll be muting my screen and I'll come back on as you wrap up.
All right, thank you so much, Ben, and thank you to everyone who's joining from all over North America, at least. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, and then we will be on our way. So our story begins in roughly 1874, when the Mennonites begin to arrive in Manitoba. specifically when they begin to arrive in Treaty 1 territory, which is where all the research for what I'm about to share took place. Currently, I'm here located on Treaty 6, but Treaty 1 and the homeland of the Métis Nation is sort of central to our story here. When the first wave of Mennonites arrived in Canada in the summer of 1874, the Toronto Globe interviewed a spokesperson from their group aboard the SS Peruvian, which arrived in Quebec City on July 27, 1874. He said that they were a religiously observant group from the Gorditza community, and that there were many large families within the group of around 600 people on that ship. Some families had as many as 8 or 10 children, and the oldest member of their party was an 82-year-old great-grandmother. This report was enthusiastically reprinted in the Manitoban and Northwest Herald, where Mennonites, coming with these large families full of women and children, were praised as a solution to Manitoba's immigration problem. I'd like to begin with telling the story of my 5 times great-grandmother, Katerina Thiessen Harder, who was on that ship. She may have been on the one that's pictured here, although I don't know exactly which steamboat she arrived, or if she was on the first steamboat that got here or not, but she was on that ship on July 27th. She immigrated to Manitoba in the summer of 1874, along with her second husband, Philip Harder, her 2 surviving adult children from her first marriage, and her oldest 4 surviving children with Philip, her second husband. Her youngest son was around 7 years old and remained behind in South Russia until he joined his family in Manitoba in 1890, when he was around 23 years old. Katerina was 52, had left behind 3 dead children, a dead husband, and her 7-year-old son, who was living, as she boarded the SS Peruvian with her husband and 5 children, a 9-year-old daughter, and sons aged 13, 18, 20, and 23. Her oldest living daughter from her first marriage, Sarah Hepner Duick, was traveling on the next ship, the SS Caspian, which arrived 2 weeks later. The 25-year-old was traveling with her husband and 3 children under the age of 4. Sarah's middle child, also named Sarah, turned 3 years old that summer in the midst of the journey. And she is my great-great-great-grandma. While all sides of my family immigrated to Manitoba between 1874 and 1880, I find this story of 3 generations of women who arrived in the first ships particularly interesting. Several generations later, in 1920 or so, Katerina's great-great-granddaughter, also named Sarah, would move to Mexico as a baby with her parents and would eventually lead her whole family, including my grandpa, Abe Friesen, back to Manitoba. But when Katerina, her daughter Sarah, and her daughter Sarah arrived in Manitoba in the summer of 1874, they likely did not know very much about where they were moving. Their journey was far from over when their ship docked at Quebec City. First, there was the train trip from Quebec to Toronto, and then overland to get to the other side of the Great Lakes, sort of, from Toronto to Collingwood, then by boat through the Great Lakes to Duluth, overland to Moorhead, and then the Red River steamship to Manitoba. First stopping in Winnipeg for supplies, and then on to St. Agathe, where it was a final 4-mile walk to the immigration sheds and temporary housing. To visualize a general map, here we go, of Manitoba and how it evolved, I'd like to begin by looking at this image here. Manitoba became a province in 1870, and this is a map from that time period, in this postage stamp formation here, a much smaller version than we're familiar with today with Manitoba. This is because Manitoba joined Canada as a result of the Métis Nation resisting the Canadian attempts to annex Manitoba as a colony of Canada. Riel and his government advocated for full provincial rights, and this smaller postage stamp sized province was part of Canada's compromise. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald did not want to give Manitoba a significant land base until the population was white and British Canadian. In the 1870 census around this time, the population was around 80% Métis, divided fairly evenly between English and French Métis, and about 12% white. Though, of course, every white person was counted. Well, First Nations and Métis were only counted if they met the census criteria of being settled and living in a permanent house. So here on this map, I think what's important to point out is that while the only significant population center that's indicated here is Winnipeg, Fort Garry area, maybe you can see, depending on what kind of screen you're looking at here, but there are these dotted lines that run all through the prairie, along the river, and also branching out. And these indicate the Red River cart trails by which people navigated and traveled and lived their lives. So while we're talking today about the Mennonite reserves, which I'll show you where they're located in a moment, it's important to note, I guess, that while the land here is not depicted as being inhabited, that does not mean it was not in use and there were not people living and using this land. Here we see a population breakdown for Manitoba in 1870. The dots represent 50 people. And you can see the people are largely located along the river, along the Assiniboine and Red Rivers. This is basically the only place at the time where people could live all year round in houses, or where people chose to live all year round and in houses. And so that's why it appears that that's where everyone lived. That's who was counted. Without access to running water or to timber, much of the prairie was considered too difficult to live upon all year round. Here we see what's over the 1870s, what the map of Manitoba begins to look like. By the end of 1870, there are a patchwork of reserves all across this province. And this does not even include the railway reserves or the Hudson Bay Company reserve land or any of the Crown reserve land. So this is really just only the Métis reserve land, First Nation reserve land, and then colonization reserves that's depicted here. This map was is used with permission from Ryan Aford, who used this for an Icelandic study, which is why that's bolded. But for our purposes here, we're focused on the Mennonite East Reserve, located right here, and the Mennonite West Reserve. And I suppose, important for this conversation, those were the first two of the colonization reserves in 1874. None of the other reserves in orange existed at that time. These reserves were presented as a solution to establishing a non-Indigenous population along the border, the Canada-US border, but also the Ontario border to some degree. And in addition to that, a settler population that was confident in their ability to succeed in farming in the open prairie, especially if they were exempt from the Dominion Lands Act policy for the liberal homestead model, which divided up sort of the rest of the land into single family units. The success of the Mennonite reserves and the high rate of failure for the homesteaders led to increased number of immigration reserves over time, as you can see here. As more and more homesteaders struggled, more and more people came up with various immigration schemes for how to bring in more ethnic groups to try to mitigate that. So Katerina may have had some idea about the stir the Mennonites caused when the first 65 families stopped for supplies in Winnipeg, and this is what Main Street of Winnipeg looked like in 1874 in the spring. And over the 3 days the first Mennonites stopped there, they spent $20,000 in 1874 dollars during that time. Newspapers reported on the good fortune of one hardware establishment where the proprietor excitedly reported that he sold $4,000 worth of goods to the Mennonites on that first day alone. That set him up for quite a profitable year. The Mennonites probably did not read the newspapers where Winnipeggers congratulated themselves on, quote, so valuable an acquisition to our population, or where the newspapers mocked the Mennonites for speaking gibberish, or made a pun that, quote, the female individuals of the Mennonites are all titled ladies, being, of course, women, o' nights. The residents of Winnipeg were all aware of the $100,000 loan that had been offered to the Mennonites to transport them to Manitoba and the additional money set aside to help them establish themselves, and were ready to take advantage of that economic boost that the Mennonite arrival brought to their city. Inevitably, during this time of traveling and establishing themselves, the Mennonites encountered large numbers of Métis people during their travel, and even more in Winnipeg. Visitors to Winnipeg years after the Mennonite arrival commented on the large numbers of Métis people present in the city. Because this was winter, they commented on the number of dog trains and Red River carts around the city, saying that, quote, the Métis have become as grasshoppers for multitude. Fictionalized accounts of the journey to Manitoba, such as Alexander Begg's Dot It Down, A Story of Life in the Northwest, which is part novel, part immigration pamphlet, described the journey on the Red River steamships in detail, and in particular described the bright colors of the Métis sashes, beaded leggings, and the handsome features of the Métis workers who hauled goods for the ships and the Hudson Bay Company and the free traders alike. In reality, most of the labor on that journey was done by these Métis workers. When people who arrived in Winnipeg were surprised by seeing so many Métis people, whose population again was more than 80% Métis, their observations were mocked in the local newspaper, with the newspaper writing things like, imagine visiting England and being completely staggered when made aware that it was Englishmen doing the work there. Certainly, the Mennonite delegation had received a glimpse a year earlier of the complicated relationships that existed between the white settler and Indigenous populations of Manitoba during their 1873 visit. That delegation arrived in the aftermath of the Reign of Terror in Winnipeg, a period when mob violence by white settlers and soldiers was commonplace against anyone identifiably Métis. English soldiers and settlers moved to Manitoba to try and put the Métis Nation in their place for daring to rise up against Canada's expansion project. While Louis Riel and many of his fellow leaders fled for their lives, hundreds of Métis families remained behind and bore the brunt of the retaliatory violence. When the Red River Expeditionary Force, led by Colonel Garnet Wolseley, arrived in Winnipeg, they were reportedly paid off and, quote, given 3 days license, quote, where they partnered with their Canadian settler allies who were already in Winnipeg and, quote, carried out armed raids and evictions while raping, assaulting, abducting, and lynching the Métis residents of Red River with impunity. And beyond those 3 days, that violence continued for years after the invasion. As Métis scholar Fred Shore explains, violence against the Métis became the order of the day, despite the fact that the RREF was supposed to represent the forces of Canadian law and order. So this Reign of Terror, which begins in 1870 and continues for the next few years, it acts as a sundering event. In an attempt to avoid the occupying army that is taking up all of the space of Winnipeg, basically, the English and French Métis communities are isolated from each other. The French population is not able to cross the river to Fort Garry safely. To do so, which people do try to do, is to risk violence. The presence of First Nations people within city limits becomes further cause for concern by around 1873. Because people are concerned that the treaty has been signed. Why are First Nations people still in the city? Why aren't they on their reserves yet? People begin to advocate in the newspaper that perhaps they should be driven out with starvation or violence. The city of Winnipeg is essentially under a military occupation, and there is a tense dynamic at play in terms of the various Indigenous and occupying groups. Outside of the city, the Métis Nation was still waiting on the land promised to them under the Manitoba Act, which guaranteed a land base for their nation. When soldiers left the city of Winnipeg to scout out land to claim for themselves, because they were promised sections of land to homestead once their military contracts ended, they were often confronted by groups of armed Métis men who would escort them back to the city, at least according to the newspaper reports. In this context of confrontation and feuding over control of land, when the Mennonite delegation was brought near Whitehorse Plains, a Métis settlement, which had been in existence since at least 1824, they too were confronted by the Métis who lived there. This event of confronting the Mennonite delegation in 1873 is described differently depending on whether you read the English or French newspaper accounts. The Manitoba Free Press described the event with the headline, "The War of Races Revived, the Mennonites Attacked by Métis." Well, Le Métis, the French newspaper, which largely serves the Métis readership, explains that it was overblown and simply the actions of a few drunk men, essentially was an overblown panic. Well, the Mennonite delegation is the subject of these articles. Within the larger context of Manitoba's political and immigration conflicts in the 1870s, this should be understood, I think, as a continuation of existing racial tensions rather than a specific targeting of the Mennonites. I don't think any group that entered that close to a current Métis village would not have been confronted and turned back, so as was the practice of the time. After all, the revival of the race war isn't about the Mennonites, who have not even begun to arrive yet, but rather about the Canadians and the Métis. And yet it is clear which side the Mennonites are seen as representing in this conflict. With this context, the response to the Mennonite deputation of 1873 can be understood as part of the ongoing Métis resistance to Canadian incursions into their land and the role that the Mennonites were playing as specially recruited settlers willing to move into land that was seen as both environmentally hostile to settlers due to a lack of trees, but was also part of a complicated push and pull between Canada and the Métis Nation. The only violence specifically mentioned in these articles is the Canadian teamster accompanying the Mennonites, who strikes a Métis man and later is reported as whipping another who had been making threats and complaints against the Canadians. And I'm going to read from this kind of middle section of the article, of this English article here. The article said that the Mennonites were overtaken at the hotel by the Métis, who gathered in quickly from all quarters as if by preconcerted action and threatened vengeance on the whole party, indulging freely in all kinds of abuse and threats regarding the Canadians, and said they would kill all they could find. The Mennonites, being, as is well known, non-combatant from religious principle, took refuge upstairs in the hotel and awaited the result. One of the teamsters, upon being insulted by a Métis man, treated the latter to a tremendous whipping, and then the Métis left to seek reinforcements and the encounter ended. However, the same day that this makes headline news in the newspaper, an article from towards the end of the issue provides some clarification on these events, saying that this first, more bombastic article was written earlier and probably mischaracterized the encounter, since in actuality this event was probably not malicious and, concurring with the French account, probably just a moment of drunken recklessness. The French article dismisses the English accounts of the events, which, as days passed, had caused the story to grow through the rumor mill into something of an armed insurrection or a massacre. Again, the restarting of the race war. The later attempts to clarify that this encounter had been overblown and misreported as an attack did little to calm tensions in a community that was already violently divided. So this meeting is perhaps not a great way to start a new relationship for the Mennonites, but nevertheless, 7,000 Mennonites, particularly those from the Gortitsa communities, chose to move to Manitoba, relying on the agreement between their leaders and Canada that they would be able to settle their land as they chose. And this is part of why they chose Manitoba. For the option to establish their village-based settlements, with exceptions to existing homestead laws, which was not offered in the United States, for example. They received reserves that were exempt from the regulations, and they could be in charge of their own education and their own culture and ways of life. These Mennonites settled first on the East Reserve and then on the West Reserve, and for the most part, by design, had few encounters with their neighbors. There was certainly curiosity about the Mennonites, as most Manitobans only encountered them when they came to Winnipeg for shopping or selling goods. And in that first winter of 1874, so when the Mennonites had only been in town or in the province for a few months, the Free Press published a report from Jacob Weishans, who was sort of representing the Mennonites publicly, who reported that the Mennonites were settling in well for their first winter. Sure, there wasn't sufficient lumber for full wooden houses for most of the settlers, the Mennonites, but they built homes of grass and such, and everyone had a warm roof over their heads and no complaints. There might have been complaints internally, but the public-facing representation was that these people are adapting well, they are settling in just fine. They will survive in this place. Newspaper readers regularly read reports of the large numbers of women and children arriving with the Mennonite groups, which was a stark contrast to the immigration of predominantly single men from Ontario and the United States who were trying to homestead on the Canadian prairie. Without knowing much about the Mennonites themselves, advice was given to incoming settlers to try and be more like the Mennonites. Bring a sturdy wife and children if you can, so they can assist in the labor of homesteading. While visiting or driving by the Mennonite villages, people regularly commented on the hard work done by all members of the community. They would see children working at various tasks, like herding animals for the village or braiding straw for fuel, and they would see women working as hard as the men at physical labor. They may not talk to each other, the Mennonites and non-Mennonites, in these encounters, but the non-Mennonites absorbed the message that the Mennonites were tough enough to survive and even to thrive on a part of the prairie otherwise seen as inhospitable. It appears, at least from the records that I have seen, that the Mennonites had generally very few interactions with their non-Mennonite neighbors. At least that made note. Eventually, there would be neighboring farmers, and the Mennonite children would provide labor, such as Mennonite boys going door to door after the government sent out a tree planting initiative to plant trees for a few pennies. But for the most part, Mennonites intentionally created their own schools, their own churches, and their own stores. So there was minimal need to have regular contact with their neighbors. Even when it came to joining the municipal system, many Mennonites preferred to delay municipalization for a time. Others were willing to join, but preferred acclamation to actual elections. When the first few harvests failed, the Mennonites did not look to the government or their Canadian neighbors for support, but rather relied on their existing mutual aid organizations. They were hesitant, especially in those early years, to assimilate into the larger Canadian world. There are stories that are not recorded in Mennonite records or in non-Mennonite records, such as the secret treaty between the Mennonite settlers and their Ojibwe neighbors. This was depicted in the Canadian Mennonite in February of 2024 and will soon be published into a graphic novel illustrated by Jonathan Dick. And I believe also at the upcoming conference will be part of a keynote, which I'm really excited to attend. According to David Scott, a historian from Swan Lake First Nation, Ojibwe tradition records that when the Mennonites arrived, they agreed they would live together in peace. But Whippoorwill, an Ojibwe leader from Rosa River, saw that the Mennonites were receiving land while his own people were not, and so the treaty was broken. The Mennonites who chose Manitoba did so primarily for the privilege of settling in immigration reserves. And the government supported this project, supported the immigration reserves, particularly for areas that were difficult to entice other settlers to settle. And the Mennonites did not really concern themselves with the surrounding reserves and if they were getting their land too. These reserves were considered a positive thing because they allowed for, on one hand, successful farming, but on the other hand, assimilative efforts and surveillance of the ethnic other. If you're going to bring in several thousand people who don't feel like they belong to your people, the British Canadians, you want to maybe keep an eye on what they're doing. And these immigration reserves received pushback. To just visualize the map again so you can see this breakdown, after the Mennonite reserves proved successful, more and more immigration reserves were created. And discussions from 1875 on in the Manitoba legislature regularly condemned the creation of these reserves. Largely because they were seen as disadvantaging the regular Canadian settlers. There were also concerns that keeping all these ethnic groups separate from each other would lead to, quote, the retention of distinct nationalities to the end of time and would prevent assimilation. And I suppose because maybe we're here at a Mennonite event, maybe that's maybe some of those fears were maybe a little bit founded. Settlers who were frustrated with the land locked up for Métis reserves or immigration reserves or other reserves would regularly become squatters and advocate that because they were the real Canadians, they should be able to claim whatever land they wanted. And so many of the accounts of Mennonites meeting their new neighbors take place within this context of Canadian settlers coming to squat on the Mennonite land. By late 1877, the Mennonites on the West Reserve were regularly dealing with squatters on their land, and in particular, blocking Mennonite access to the limited amount of timber available. So this is particularly the case for the West Reserve here, and this sort of western part of the West Reserve is where the escarpment and Pembina Valley are, which provide a good amount of timber for really the entire rest of the West Reserve, because there's not a ton of trees in the rest of this space. So kind of out here where the city of Morden is roughly today, this sort of becomes the site of conflict as settlers begin to move closer and closer to where the Mennonites are and potentially blocking them from, from this land that is part of their reserve. The squatters moved on to the reserve, and the Manitoba government did not take direct action to address it, beyond documenting it and occasionally sending the timber inspector to check on things, because there were regulations about how much timber people could be using. Interestingly, this dispute over Mennonite land reserves and Canadian squatters received coverage in the French language newspaper, Le Métis, even though a lot of their concerns about squatting had to do with their own reserves, which are not really too close to the West Reserve here, but they cared about this. The newspaper's readers were sympathetic to the Mennonite cause because they were fighting their own battles with Canadian squatters. And they called these squatter settlers, quote, well, I'm translating, people who pretend to be above the law, end quote. And they shamed them for stirring up unnecessary violence when they were clearly in the wrong. The article in Le Métis also raised concerns that the Mennonites had been promised access to these wooded lands and questioned how this would happen if the squatters refused to move. While the English newspapers called for the government to hurry up and open up the reserve and allow these squatters to take that land legally, the French language newspaper called on the government to enforce the law with more strength and to protect the Mennonite reserve lands and the promises made to them. This dispute over squatters and Mennonite timber access escalated because the Canadian settlers weren't going anywhere. And English newspapers reported that the Mennonites had taken a load of wood from a homestead claim, but did not specify in their report whether that claim was a legal claim or a squatter's claim, so whether it was on or off the reserve. And this event resulted in the, quote, rough handling of one Mennonite man and 12 others who were summoned on charges of trespassing and stealing. 10 Mennonites were arrested for refusing to pay the fine of stealing timber and trespassing. But their friends came and rescued 5 of the prisoners. This results in the Menno-Canuck difficulty. This prompted a debate within the newspaper between various articles back and forth, letters to the editor and the newspaper paper writers commenting, as various parties expressed concern that the Mennonites did not respect the local authorities and viewed themselves as above the law, and even laughed when the constable came to apprehend them. They wouldn't pay the fine, and then they wouldn't allow themselves to be arrested. This push to allow Canadian settlers to encroach upon the Mennonite Reserve only escalated as the decade continued, and by 1880 there were regular articles about the land rush taking place in the West Reserve, where essentially everyone was anticipating that in 1880 the reserve system would be ended and the land would just be available for the taking. So many squatters were just going and taking land so that they would have it for whenever the reserve was opened up. This resulted in an anecdotal interaction between a Mennonite and a squatter who met one of them one day, and this was reported in the newspaper. He thanked him for breaking 5 acres of his land for him. As more and more Canadian settlers desired the land reserved for the Mennonites, they were no longer seen as the advance guard ushering in the progress of a new province. Instead, the Mennonites are now a barrier to the success of real Canadians. In the East Reserve, from what I can tell, there was less concern over Canadian squatters, but Mennonites were not without controversy here, and in fact may have been squatters themselves. At least 15 Métis families found themselves displaced by the first Mennonite settlers. Donovan Giesbrecht, who this map is taken from, argues that there are over 30 letters and a memorandum that were written back and forth concerning Métis rights to several sections that became the East Reserve, including the very first Mennonite village of Grainfeld. Mennonite letters from this time don't bear any account of this, according to him, but considering the many challenges facing Métis petitions at the Dominion Lands Office, the prime location of mob violence during the Reign of Terror, the existence of any petitions at all suggests that these families felt strongly about their claims. In the summer of 1874, the same time that Katerina Thiessen-Harder and her daughter Sarah were getting off the boats and arriving in their new home in the East Reserve, Roger Goulet, a Métis surveyor, visited the Mennonite Reserve to look into these claims and figure out what land belonged to whom. Goulet, writing about the encounter 20 years later, said that when the Métis claimants showed him their claims, he confirmed that the land that composed these claims was not to be given to the Mennonites and was entered as such in the Dominion Lands Office. He recalls doing it himself. Nevertheless, within a year of that 1874 encounter, the Métis entries were denied and the Mennonites ended up possessing that land. Giesbrecht concludes that even though the Mennonites didn't ever mention it, quote, the land patent application files clearly reveal significant tensions between the Métis families and government officials over the land surrounding Grainfeld, but also neighboring Tanano and Rosenfeld. All the evidence suggests that despite petitions to provincial and federal governments, this was yet another example of the Canadian government deliberately avoiding Métis land claims by stalling. Inaction meant that the Mennonites went about setting up their new lives, unbothered by displacing their would-be neighbors. The Mennonites in, I believe, this same community of Grainfeld, although here it's listed as Grinfeld in French here, did reach out to the Métis newspaper. In 1878, a letter to the editor was, as you can see here, translated from German into French, and I'm going to now paraphrase parts of it back to you. So perhaps there are things lost in translation here, but the general idea is this is a letter expressing thanks to the Métis as well as to the Manitoba government for welcoming the Mennonites. The letter writer, a devoted and sincere Mennonite, writes that they felt at peace and at home here, and they were so grateful to the Métis for making them feel that way. Loosely translated, the Mennonite author writes that they were initially concerned that they were moving to a backwards country populated by uncivilized people without morals and without laws, but instead found themselves amidst an honest and hospitable people. They had experienced no fear. The author says that while they know the Mennonites might seem strange to their neighbors, they would like to live in unity with their neighbors as they all tried to remain faithful to God, Mennonites, Catholics, and Protestants alike. These are kind sentiments, but I'm sure they did little to resolve the land dispute. But it's interesting that out of all the Mennonite villages, it appears to be this village in the middle of a land dispute where someone reached out anonymously to the very community on the other side of the conflict. The majority Métis population of Manitoba in 1870 was a problem for the settler colonial ambitions of Canada. They didn't want to have a nation with a province that was predominantly Métis. But the Mennonite reserves solved a problem. And so governments sided with the Mennonites against the Métis, and even at times against the Canadian settlers, such as allowing them to have the reserves in the first place, even after there was pushback. Government visits, such as by Governor General Dufferin to the Mennonites, where he made this lovely sketch, contained messaging that invited Mennonites to be included into the new colonial order. saying, this is a quote that maybe you've heard before, I've said it before, the war to which we invite you as recruits and comrades is a war waged against the brute forces of nature. But those forces will welcome our domination and reward our attack by placing their treasures at our disposal. It is a war of ambition, for we intend to annex territory after territory, but neither blazing villages nor devastated fields will mark our ruthless track. Our battalions will march across the illimitable plains which stretch before us as sunshine steals athwart the ocean, and the rolling prairie will blossom in our wake, and corn and peace and plenty will spring where we have trod. So this is obviously militaristic language that may seem out of place in a speech given by the Governor General to the pacifist audience of the Mennonites. But the goal of the speech is to communicate how the Mennonites fit into the narrative of Canadian colonialism. They are part of this work. Their pacifism was in fact also central to that point, as evident in the language just before this quote, which clarified, "Nor will you be called upon in the struggle to stain your hands with human blood, a task which is so abhorrent to your religious feelings." The Mennonite aversion to direct violence was well known, and yet they were recruited into the annexation of territory and seen as valuable allies in the conquering of Manitoba. Mennonites were generally written about in favorable terms in the newspapers, if for no other reason than the Mennonite presence was adding to the not Catholic and not Francophone and not Métis demographic, which was the main political and social divide in Manitoba in the 1870s. Private citizens might have their own thoughts about the Mennonites, as one young man certainly did. A new settler writing to his mother in England described taking the train through the West Reserve by calling the Mennonites dirty people. But in the larger immigration literature and newspapers, as long as Mennonites kept to themselves and did not have political ambitions of their own, or weren't trying to, let's say, rebel against the colonial government, they were seen as an asset to the Anglo-Canadian population. And despite that one account, Mennonite homes and gardens were repeatedly praised during formal visits as perfectly clean and tidy, and the people described as plain but frugal and superlatively industrious. All the things you could want from ethnic immigrants, after all. Mennonites arriving to Manitoba in the 1870s had a variety of experiences with their new neighbors. These encounters were all shaped by the settler colonial context, as well as by the Mennonites' own desire to isolate within their community. Despite this, they still interacted with settlers and Indigenous communities, sometimes as allies and sometimes in conflict. Mennonites were in conflict with their Indigenous neighbors when it came to governments giving them the land that was promised to Métis or First Nations. But yet, when Canadian settlers squatted on Mennonite land, it was the Métis press that came to their defense and drew attention to their promises that were being broken, calling out the settlers for violating the laws and potentially blocking the Mennonites from their promised access to timber. Well, at least one Mennonite correspondent wrote into the Métis newspaper to express gratitude for welcoming and peaceful neighbors. Mennonites didn't view themselves, from what I have read, as squatters on land that had been claimed by Métis families. When Mennonite land was desired by Canadian settlers, those settlers had no problem breaking the laws and squatting on it, but then seemed surprised when the Mennonites also didn't think the local laws applied to them, taking people out of prison, refusing arrest, laughing at attempts to make them pay fines. Perhaps that this exposed the dual reality that Canadian settlers didn't want to acknowledge. They didn't think they needed to follow the laws that they didn't agree with, and the Mennonites had that same perspective. Indigenous people in Manitoba did not have the option to reject laws without consequences, but both Canadian and Mennonite settlers did to some degree, as the government was more concerned with whatever made them profitable, successful settlers, more than the exact letter of the law and what was right or wrong. Because regardless of whatever the individual squatters felt about their Mennonite neighbors, Manitoba and Canada viewed the Mennonites favorably. To conclude this presentation, you may realize that the Mennonites had very few documented encounters with their neighbors. But the encounters they did have reveal a fascination with the Mennonite women and children, as well as with the structure of villages and how they led to more success than homesteaders were having. The tone of the encounters with the Mennonites was dependent on whether or not the Mennonites were viewed as an asset to the province or nation, or as a competition and barrier to other settler success. When the larger kind of institutions of the nation or province are looking at the Mennonites, it's overwhelmingly positive. When it's your neighboring settler who would like your land, but it's being denied your land, that's when things are more complicated. In this way, it quickly becomes clear that in many of these interactions, Mennonites meeting their neighbors was less about the two individuals having the interaction and more about the larger settler colonial context shaping those meetings. I'm sure there were many interactions that took place without documentation or that seemed too casual for anyone to remember or bother writing down. But the stories that we do know reveal a complicated set of experiences that were intertwined within the larger world of 1870s Manitoba. Thank you. And now, assuming there's time, I'll be happy to take questions.
Well, thank you so much, Shelisa, for that excellent and nuanced presentation of Mennonites' many encounters with their neighbors in Manitoba. I couldn't help but be a little bit struck spending a lot of time reading newspaper articles from the Bolivian context from the 1960s, 70s, and onwards, where descendants of those same Mennonites were arriving, to see many similar themes. Certainly parliamentary debates about the merits or demerits of Mennonites as they arrived and as they kind of fit. I think you nicely put it into the sort of settler colonial context. On the ground conflicts over resources and land rights, land occupations that might have happened on the borders of some of these recently established colonies, and sometimes strange alliances that might have emerged as well, expedient ones, which interests seem to align or diverge at particular points in time. So thank you for putting that all out there for us to really kind of think about. I see questions are starting to appear in the Q&A. I'll give just a few seconds for those to pop in. Can I just ask, because you begin with a family connection to this history. Can you tell us a little bit more about what drew you into studying this topic? Knowing that a PhD is a lengthy undertaking, which is only the beginning of a broader process as you move into academia. So, what drew you to this story to begin with, and what kind of shaped your choice about using particular types of sources, looking at newspapers, for instance?
Yeah, well, I came to this topic of wanting to understand sort of Mennonites within this larger settler colonial context, because I knew that all my family arrived kind of in this one wave, right? And I also, as I was becoming a historian and learning things about Canada and Manitoba, I was very, aware that that Manitoba in the 1870s was an Indigenous province, in terms of the majority population, in terms of, at least at the beginning of that decade, who has the power and the land. And so I was struck by there had to have been some overlap or some interesting things going on there. But also, I was born in the Paw, Manitoba, to parents who were both working at a Pasquoyat Cree Nation. And then we relocated to Morden, and but my parents would tell stories about working on the reserve, but also about growing up and there being a lot of people in their peer group from the 60s scoop, so Indigenous people in Mennonite families. My dad grew up on a farm that was right near a road allowance community near McGregor area. And so I would hear these stories of how Mennonites were not separate from the other things that are happening in Indigenous history in Canada. But I found myself, I guess, not frustrated, but I guess intrigued by the lack of how our own history didn't always include those stories. So I guess it was a combination of learning about the 1870s, but then also kind of family stories that kept popping up where I was like, there had to have, there's enough here, I think, to at least consider talking about and thinking about that the Mennonites are not separate from the stories of Indigenous history and settler colonial history in Canada.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Really tying it into more contemporary era. We do have questions in the Q&A, and I won't steal any more time for those from those folks. So the first question from Peter is one thinking about, I guess, areas in which Mennonites settled on the East Reserve on lands that have been promised to Métis. Did any Mennonites inherit actual homesteads, for instance, with improvements, a log cabin or something, for instance, that would have belonged to a Métis family?
Yeah, I believe so. I don't have exact I don't have that exact information with me right now, but I believe on the East Reserve, because there were many Métis who were farming in that area, who were removed from their homes, and so I believe there would have been at least a few Mennonite families who would have walked into a Métis cabin ready to go. Again, I know I've read this somewhere, but I don't have it in front of me right now. But I would say that very possibly, yes, particularly on the East Reserve, where there were cabins there. Yes.
Wonderful. We'll keep on going as we have a number of questions, which is great. Christiane was looking just for a bit of clarification in this sort of question of squatters or land occupations on the West Reserve. So who were these individuals squatting on Mennonite lands? Were they recent arrivals from central Canada or?
Yes. Yes, so in the newspapers in the 1870s, the term squatter is applied to any, for the most part, these are white settlers who would like land, but are not willing to go through the homestead lands claims process. And so instead, they're just taking whatever land that they see in front of them that they decide is unoccupied, and they are just setting up a house on it. So that could be, in many cases, that includes, so on the map that I showed you that had like the Métis reserves marked in, I think it was green. So in many cases, they're moving onto the Métis reserves and again, taking up these houses that are there and just like, and the farms that are there, and they're just like moving into them. But it also included like just squatting on hay reserves or timber reserves or railway reserves. It's essentially a settler who views themselves as not needing to go through any sort of paperwork process and is just moving in and just grabbing whatever land they want. And they are assuming that eventually, once all of the 1870s land business is sorted out with all these reserves, that when the reserves are opened up, that the government will recognize their claim because they're white Canadian settlers, and why wouldn't they? So for the most part, that's who we're talking about when we're talking about squatters, is largely settlers from largely Ontario, but sometimes the United States, who are moving in and just taking some spot for themselves.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you for, again, we'll move forward with questions we have here. Lloyd Penner asks a bit about the Mennonite delegates who decided to go to the United States. Did the encounter, again, the so-called Dominion Day brawl that you add complexity to for us, but would that encounter with the Métis have influenced their decisions to migrate to the US as opposed to Canada?
Yeah, I mean, possibly. I mean, it is possible that for some people that was, I mean, there were many pros and cons that people considered when deciding which nation would suit their people the best. So some people didn't want to bother with the reserve system and just wanted to kind of get their land, and the land in, say, Kansas was seen as probably better than the land in Manitoba. And so they didn't really care if they couldn't set up their reserves and their villages, they would just take the better land. Some people preferred the American style of government, kind of leaving things alone to the states. Some people wanted the assurances of being part of a larger monarchy and empire and the security that brought with it. So I think different groups had their own pros and cons for their people, and I think it's very likely that that an encounter with a seemingly hostile group of Métis might have been, like, for one, like, that's just like one more thing on the con list potentially, right? If you're already leaning that direction, maybe that's one thing that tips you over potentially. I don't know, but there were many factors. I don't think there, from what I know, I don't know of any people who that was the main factor in deciding it. But there's push and pull factors for all immigration processes. So I don't want to say no one considered it, but one of many considerations.
Certainly. All right, we have another question from Di Brandt, who asked a bit about the ongoing relationships, Indigenous Mennonite relations on the West Reserve, and whether you could speak about that. She adds, just growing up, she remembers in the 50s and 60s, there were often, she says, teepees in the back pastures when we woke up in the morning, indicating an ongoing Indigenous presence on the West Reserve. Do you want to comment on that, or are you able to reflect on that?
I don't have a whole lot of information about that. I haven't been able to find a ton, other than that I know that when the Mennonites move on to the West Reserve, there are a bunch of burial mounds that are located in that area that people from nearby reserves do seem to access from time to time, for ceremonial reasons and such. So I know that they're like, the Mennonites, I think, are aware that like some of this land is important, but I don't know of any specific encounters that that took place or that I've come across. But I think that'll be a great, if you happen to go to the keynote led by David Scott, he might know a whole lot more about that. So
Certainly, yeah, I think,
yeah,
and perhaps the growing sugar beet economy, which brought in a lot of Indigenous labor, might have been an aspect of that.
for sure, that's right.
People would work the land and also temporarily set up along sometimes creeks or streams in the area.
Great.
Okay, I mentioned parallels to Bolivia. Other folks are interested in whether this story seems to resonate with prior experiences in the Russian Empire, in present Ukraine, Khortytsa and Mochna, and relationships with neighbors there. Would Mennonites have kind of understood what they were getting into based on how they related to their neighbors in the areas that your ancestors, Catherine and Sarah, were leaving?
I mean, possibly. I'm not an expert in the Russia and Ukraine Mennonite experience, as much as many other people maybe here are. But there, it is similar in the sense that like Mennonites are aware of what it's like to take land from people where there are already people living on that land, right? I don't know that in the 1870s there was like as much peasant labor employed. Like I don't think that I don't have any knowledge of like hiring, for example, Métis and First Nations people in the way that like Ukrainians were hired by Mennonites. So I don't know if it was the exact same, but certainly there is an experience there of recognizing other people do think this land is important, but we're going to be the ones farming it now. I think that there are parallels there, right? Of being able to kind of cope with the cognitive dissonance of this is our home, but other people do call it home too.
Wonderful, yeah, and I think I'll let you respond to one more question. I know we've kind of hit you with again a rapid fire series of Q&As here, but I will note with extreme pleasure we've had 105 people in attendance right now, so I guess we had to expect a little bit of pushback in the Q&A here. So the last one I'll go with is from Brian, who asks about agreements about access to timber in the Pembina Hills and the escarpment. Was this formalized in the agreement Mennonites had upon arriving? Were they just simply making use of this?
I think it's, from what I understand, I don't know that it's actually like in their official document, but I think it's more just that they were under the impression, I think correctly, from what I understand, that that the boundaries of the reserve extended into a timbered area that was theirs to have access to. So so I don't know that it was specifically in writing that it was promised to them, but it was sort of promised like these are your townships, so they belong to you to use how you want. So I think that was sort of the indication that when people start moving on there who aren't Mennonites, there's sort of an awareness of that township maybe is still supposed to be ours. But I think that's where the conflict lies. I don't know that there was a specific clause in the Mennonite agreement with the government.
Okay. And Shelisa, I've been neglecting the actual chat, but we have many wonderful comments here. Wonderful paper, very informative, vivid storytelling. Folks really enjoyed this. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us tonight in this webinar. We look forward to seeing you. I'll give our own plug here in October at our fall conference, the subject Settlers, Citizens, the 1870s Mennonites in Historical Context. And so that will run, oh, wonderful. Our host, Evan, has put it up on the screen. That's October 4th and 5th. You can go to the CTMS website to look at that. It's a conference that is also supported by the Plett Foundation. And indeed, we'll have an anniversary kind of reflection of the Plett Foundation's role in kind of promoting historical memory among scholars over the past decades. So thanks to everyone, and we will sign off here from Winnipeg and Alberta and everywhere else you're tuning in from. Have a wonderful evening, and look forward to seeing you in October in person or on the Zoom.